Բարևձեզ, մեդիակենտրոնն առցանց քննարկում է սկսում վատ խաղաղություն կամ լավ պատերազմ, որն է Արցախյան խնդրի լուծումը թեմայով։ Ներկայացնեմ մեր բանախոսներին Լորենս Բրոերս, քաղաքագետ վերլուծաբան, Լոնդոնյան հաշտեցման ռեսուրսների խաղավարար ընկերության Կովկասի ծրագրերի տնօրեն, Լորիս Նավասարդյան, Երևանի մամուլի ակումբի նախագահ, Երևանի միության արևելյան գործընկերության քաղաքացիական հասարակության ազգային պլատֆորմի նախկին համակարգող, Դենիս Սամութ, Լինքս ընկերության ղեկավար, Հարավային Կովկասի քաղաքական հետազոտությունների հեղինակ, փորձագետ Սամվել Ռուբինյանը սինխրոն թարգմանի քննարկումը հայերեն կամ անգլերեն տարբերակը լսելու համար խնդրում եմ ստեղ 1 Ter-Petrosian կոճակը։ Հարգելի բանախոսներ, շնորհակալություն մեր հրավերին արձագանքելու համար, նախ խնդրում եմ ներկայացրեք ձեր տեսակետը, որքանով էր Արցախյան խնդրի ռազմական այսպիսի մասշտաբով ընթացքը կանխատեսելի։ Լայնամասշտաբ պատերազմը պայմանավորում է ԳԱՀԿ Մինսկի խմբի աշխատանքի մեթոդով արդյունավետ կամ ոչ այնքան արդյունավետ, թե պատերազմը անխուսափելի էր ամեն դեպքում։ Համեցեք, թերևս խնդրեմ բոլորի ձեր կարծիքը ներկայացնեք, պարոն Բրոերս, սկսենք ձեզնից։ Այսինքն կրկնեմ նորից հարցը։
Sorry, I missed the interpretation channel. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. Please, Mr. Sam.
I think everybody expected another conflict. Perhaps people didn't know when it would happen and on what scale. I think there are three kind of broad framing factors here. The first is a top-down factor, the decline in multilateral diplomacy across the world, the decline of a unipolar order, a values-based order, and the inability of multilateral organizations to resolve conflicts in Eurasia, in the Middle East, and beyond. A second factor is a kind of a bottom-up factor, the hollowing out of the OSCE's mediation mechanism in this particular conflict. Each side, I think, has had an alternative strategy to mediation. On the Armenian side, that was the continued informal incorporation of Nagorno-Karabakh into a single cultural, political, and security Armenian space. And on the Azerbaijani side, that was increasing military capacity in order to be able to achieve military preponderance and win the conflict that way. A third factor that I would add is regionalization, that as multilateral diplomacy has declined, regional powers have aspirations to fill the power vacuum. And I think here we see the role of Turkey clearly playing that role of a regional power, aspiring to increased status. So I think these are the different factors in the long term. In the short term, we can look at the failure of the Preparing Populations for Peace discourse and rhetoric last year. We should remember that 2019 was actually one of the quietest years, if not the quietest year on record in terms of ceasefire violations. But there was a regrettable deterioration in the rhetorical climate, some symbolic moves that were received very badly in Azerbaijan, and the escalation in July, which created, I think, the setting for the current conflict.
Շնորհակալություն, պարոն Բրոերս, խնդրեմ ձեր տեսակետը։ Պարոն Սամութին, ներողություն, պարոն Սամութին եմ դիմում։
I think the situation we're in was predictable, and it was predicted. It certainly was created by a situation where we have seen the conflict evolve from the time of the early 1990s into a very serious confrontation between two states that have built up a huge military arsenal in the last few years, and also a situation whereby we have experienced a deterioration in the way that people looked at this conflict and at its solution. I have been involved in this for many years. I remember one of the first events that I participated in involving the Karabakh conflict. Boris was there in 1996, I think. And I can tell you that from one year to another year, one felt that there was a deterioration of the situation, that there was a situation where people felt that this conflict now had no solution, and that there were only two ways to go. One was to freeze it in the way that it was, to maintain the status quo. The other one was to challenge the status quo and go to war. So those were the two narratives. The third narrative, let's work and solve this conflict, was the least popular one. And it became less and less and less popular as time went by, from the time of the ceasefire in 1994 until today. I can say that every year was worse than the year before. I agree with Lawrence that last year there was some hope. There was a little lull in the fighting on the line of contact, but in the fighting in other spheres, in the propaganda war, in the diplomatic war, this was as intensive as before. This conflict has three dimensions, even now. Of course, there's fighting going on the ground, terrible situation, but there's also a propaganda war, an information war going on, quite vicious, actually. I'm quite surprised at the levels it's reached. And there is, of course, a very intensive diplomatic war being waged in different contexts. So three different layers of conflict. And sometimes we get a little bit complacent because we say, the ceasefire is holding. There were not too many shootings this morning between one side and the other. But actually, when you put all these three together, this conflict has accelerated from year to year, to a point where for some time now, it was predictable to say something is going to give. And that's something, unfortunately, has been what has been happening since the 27th of September.
I fully agree with my colleagues that the conflict was quite predictable, and only the timing and the scale of the war would be very difficult to predict. And here we can speak about the signs that were prompting that there will be this war. And there were some reasons also, and we have to differentiate those. The signs started from mid-2019, I think, and they were coming from the meetings of Armenian and Azerbaijani officials. If before mid-2019, there were mostly positive, let's say, references to the negotiation process from the ministers, first of all, from Ahmedyarov and from Manatsakanyan. However, since maybe September of 2019, after each meeting, we were receiving rather negative references to what happened and about what the sides were talking about. The second clear sign was, I think, the debate between Pashinyan and Aliyev in the margins of Munich Security Conference. which was assessed by the organizers as very positive dialogue. However, this debate was a sign that dialogue is not happening at all. And I perfectly remember what were the disputes between Armenians and Azerbaijanis in mid-90s, which Denis also referred to. And I have to say that the things that Pashinyan and Aliyev were telling each other in Munich were almost the same as the sides were telling to each other immediately after the early 90s war. So it meant that there is no progress, and in the same time, there is not more tolerance toward the status quo, at least from the side of Azerbaijan. And the next clear sign was in early July when talking on the occasion of the Day of Azerbaijani National Army, Ilham Aliyev allowed insulting messages to Armenians, to Armenia, and to leadership of Armenia, which was kind of a message that no more negotiations will take place. And this was perfectly understood, I think, for those who are following the developments. And finally, after the July escalation, we saw the huge mass manifestation in Azerbaijan, which couldn't be imagined before, given that any, let's say, manifestation of public opinion or public disappointment or public support in Azerbaijan was not possible before. But this one was allowed, even under the situation of the pandemic and the measures taken by Azerbaijani government regarding coronavirus. And I think the main thing that was coming from this manifestation was that Azerbaijan with Turkey, I think this message was also quite clear in those days, have to start the war against Artsakh and Armenia. And after that, it was perfectly clear that someday the war will start. But here we can speak also about very briefly about the reasons. These were the signs that I listed. And the reasons, the main reasons are connected, yes, I agree with Lawrence, certain regional developments. And first of all, growing ambitions of Turkey and readiness of Turkey to completely, in all senses, back Azerbaijan in any war against Armenians. And the second regional factor was that if before, and the best example was 2016 April war and even July escalation, that Russia is more or less controlling the situation. And if even Russia would allow certain clashes, there was kind of confidence in Moscow they can stop it any day, any moment. While in September, it was clear that the situation is completely out of the control of Moscow. And then the factor of Turkey and the factor of the moods in Azerbaijani society became dominating. And in that sense, I guess that indeed, despite the timing of the start of the war was and the scale was very difficult to determine. However, it was clear that it will not last long before the start of this
war. Շնորհակալություն, հաջորդ հարցը 1994 թվականին Հայաստանի Հանրապետության, Լեռնային Ղարաբաղի ու Ադրբեջանի Հանրապետության միջև անժամկետ հրադադար կնքվեց։ Կարող են խաղումներ անել բանակցային ընթացքին, խնդրի կարգավորման այս կամ այն սկզբունքին, սակայն հիմա ունենք այն, ինչ ունենք, խախտվել է երեք կողմի միջև կնքված լեգիտիմ հրադադարը։ Կա իրավական գործիք, որը հրադադարի խախտման լայնամասշտաբ պատերազմով կտրվի իրավական գնահատական։ Պարոն Բրոյերս, խնդրեմ ձեր տեսակետը եւ ապա կլսենք նաեւ մյուս մեր բանախոսներին։ Համեցեք։
Well, yes, we've seen two ceasefires that have been nominally agreed and then not acted on. Sorry. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So two ceasefires have been agreed. I very much agree with what Boris was saying. What we saw in 2016 was that within 4 days, Moscow was able to convene security chiefs from each side in Moscow and to broker a ceasefire that held. And that is no longer the case. I think that is indicative of a decline in Russian leverage. And this is one of the three factors that I think are crucial to assessing whether a ceasefire can hold. So the first one is, do outside parties have leverage to force and induce the parties to agree to a ceasefire? And I think we can safely say that that is not the case at present. A second factor would be whether the goals of the military goals on the battlefield have been achieved or not. There was speculation at about a week, 10 days into this war, that the aim was to regain control over one or two of the occupied regions in order to then re-enter the negotiations process. And I think it's been clear for some time now that the military goals are more ambitious. The speech given by President Ilham Aliyev the day before yesterday, I believe, indicated that the goals are to reassert control over Nagorno-Karabakh as a whole. And as we understand, the fighting is approaching Lachin as we speak. So it seems that that rationale also is not available. The third rationale for a ceasefire would be that the cost of fighting has become too high to carry on. And I think here also we see that this isn't effective. We don't know the true extent of casualties. President Putin yesterday said that he believed that some 5,000 people have been killed, 2,000 on each side, obviously slightly more than that if we get to 5,000. So losses have been very heavy. My understanding is that on the Armenian side, this is seen as an existential struggle. So there is really little space to step away and agree to a ceasefire under those conditions. And in Azerbaijan, I think there's been a lot of reporting on the public support for this war. This isn't just a top-down decision. This is something that has the backing of society. So unfortunately, I don't see at present any particular factor that could induce the parties to agree to a ceasefire and stick to it.
If I can add one or 2 points to this, I think, first of all, we are looking at a very different situation now than existed on the 27th of September in terms of how the military of the two sides are engaged with each other. So a ceasefire is not going to be, in any situation, even with the best will of both sides, a simple affair. Up to the 27th of September, there was a clear line of contact, and there were skirmishes sometimes on small, really small pieces of land that had not been under one side or the other side. But what we have now is there has been movement in different ways across the line of contact. I think the first process is going to have to be some kind of disengagement to allow a ceasefire to take place. So a perfect ceasefire is something very far away, as my colleague Lawrence has mentioned. However, if the sides decide that they do not want to continue with the war, they can, of course, we can see a lull in the fighting, and I think we're getting there. I think we're getting to a point where the intensity of the fighting is a bit less now than it was a few days ago. The weather is also playing its part in the story, because now we're entering the period of bad weather in the Caucasus, and this is not very good for the sort of fighting that has been going on. So the weather may do what the politicians and the diplomats will fail, but only very temporarily. But I think we all feel that there is a need now for a period of calm on the battlefront, so that somehow the political process can start. But going forward, I think what we saw up to now, which is a ceasefire since 1994, very imperfect and broken every day here and there, but it, by and large, it lasted, the ceasefire, without the presence of a peacekeeping force or a monitoring force. I think we cannot go back to that point. I think that point now we've moved on from that point. And I think for a ceasefire to really hold going forward until a political process evolves is going to require either a substantial monitoring force or possibly a peacekeeping force, which is a little bit more controversial.
Yes, of course, this military technical factor and the situation in the front line were one of the reasons why ceasefire, or truce as it is called in some media, was very difficult to establish. Because even after agreeing on ceasefire, each side wanted to start this ceasefire situation after getting certain successes in the front line and to fix it somehow, which of course is very difficult to combine, but both sides consider that they are in favorable situation. Either one side or another feels that it needs some more minutes probably to improve their positions in the front line. But of course, political reasons are also very strong here. And again, I want to stress the appearance of new factor, which did not exist in any previous periods of escalation. If before this could be, let's say, the mediators from the Minsk group, a special, let's say, role and influence of Russia, and of course, the sides themselves, Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan. Now we had very strong factor of Turkey, which would not be happy about ceasefire if it does not bring obvious military success and advancement of, let's say, Azerbaijani positions deep in the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, or if everyone would agree that the say of Turkey in this conflict is much more important than it was before. Either of these consequences could be acceptable for Turkey, and Turkey would back the ceasefire. But this was not happening. And that is why I think the signals from Turkey to the Azerbaijani allies and to the society, which is very important, because in fact we have now in Azerbaijan the government, the leadership, that I think is more flexible and more ready to compromises than the society plus political factor of Turkey. This was playing, I think, very important role in the situation when ceasefire was agreed but not implemented. And of course, we have to understand that the pandemic is also an important context for all this. When the world is completely busy and the international community is completely busy with the challenges of COVID-19, of course, its active role in any conflict could hardly be expected. And all these factors together do not allow to expect that either October 10 or October 18 ceasefire agreements will be enacted. And to achieve that, probably achieve in quotes, of course, is that the number of casualties are recognized and affecting the public opinion, first of all, in Azerbaijan. Because Azerbaijani society is in euphoria, is so happy about a strong role of Turkey in this conflict. And on the other side, they do not have reliable information about the size of the casualties. So when this information will be accessible, probably we could speak about certain dynamics in the moods in Baku and in Azerbaijan in general. And of course, I think that claims that ceasefire, especially humanitarian ceasefire, is not in favor of Azerbaijan and Turkey, because I guess anyway, the information about mercenaries and about involvement of Turkey is although not officially it is not recognized, but I think that this information is close to the reality. And any ceasefire and humanitarian actions with the participation of Red Cross would disclose all these things that are not accepted yet by Azerbaijan and Turkey. And this will, in the diplomatic diplomatic sense and in terms of reputation of Azerbaijan and Turkey before the international community, it will be damaging for this. And yes, this is also an important factor that we have to take into account.
Շնորհակալություն։ ԵՀԿ-ի խմբի համանախագահ երկրները ընդունել են, որ այս պատերազմում կան արտաքին ուժեր, եղել են հայտարարություններ ամենաբարձր մակարդակով, թե ահաբեկիչների ներգրավման մասին, թե արտաքին ուժերի մասնակցության բացառման մասին։ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության նախագահ Արմեն Սարգսյանը հոկտեմբերի 21-ին Բրյուսելում ՆԱՏՕ-ի գլխավոր քարտուղար Յենս Ստոլտենբերգի հետ հանդիպման ժամանակ տվեց արտաքին այդ ուժի անունը ՆԱՏՕ-ի անդամ Թուրքիա։ Ինչպես է գնահատում Թուրքիայի ուղղակի ներգրավվածությունն այս պատերազմում եւ տարածաշրջանային անվտանգության ու երկարատև խաղաղության համար ինչ վտանգներ եք տեսնում, հատկապես եթե հաշվի առնենք նաեւ որ Թուրքիան պատրաստակամություն է հայտնել զորքեր օգտագործել Արցախի դեմ Ադրբեջանի դիմելուն պես։ Պարոն Բրոերս, համեցեք։
Well, yes, this is one of the kind of defining debates and aspects of this new war is the more explicit support. Obviously, the Turkish factor is not new. Turkey has always supported Azerbaijan morally and politically. We saw that in April 2016. But that support appears to have intensified in recent years, and we saw quite intense contacts between officials of the two ministries of defense of the two countries in the aftermath of the July 2020 escalation. Many aspects of this support remain extremely controversial. They appear to be enacted within a framework of plausible deniability, and we don't know yet for sure what the extent of this support is. What we can say is that Azerbaijani military goals have been achieved in ways that were not possible before in April 2016. And that if we assume that Turkey is supporting, then that policy is much easier for Turkey to enact than for Russia to enact its leverage through diplomacy in the peace process. So leverage on the battlefield meets leverage in the peace process, and the former is currently dominant. In terms of risks for long-term security and peace, I mean, I think obviously if Azerbaijan achieves significant military success, then Turkey will have a long-lasting and locally legitimate influence in Azerbaijan. I think in terms of risks to peace, the main risk would be this process of regionalization, that the Karabakh peace process becomes disattached, separated from a multilateral diplomatic framework and re-embedded within a regional kind of a bilateral deal-making, geopolitical pact-making process between Russia and Turkey. This conflict could, if that process happens, become simply another conflict theater alongside others, where Russia and Turkey are active, sometimes operating as rivals, but also as partners to manage pragmatically their relations. And I think the risk there is that developments coming out of such a situation would ultimately reflect Russian and Turkish interests rather than Armenian and Azerbaijani interests as such. And it would be very top-down, and it wouldn't necessarily be able to address the core concerns of communities in this conflict, the core concerns around identity, around voice, around representation. So that I would see as the key risk. Of course, one could argue that the multilateral diplomatic process to date hasn't been able to address those issues any better. But still, I think a more liberal approach is ultimately needed to resolve this conflict within a multilateral framework, rather than an illiberal approach through a top-down geopolitical one.
Can I add to this a couple of words? Because I think that the issue of how Turkey has got involved in this is a little bit misunderstood. Turkey's relations with Azerbaijan are very, very deeply rooted, and the mantra that this is one nation, two states is not just simply a political slogan, but is something that is actually felt in both Turkey and in Azerbaijan. What happened in 1992-94, the defeat of Azerbaijan, happened because the situation in Turkey was such, and the international situation was such, that Turkey could only watch as this happened. And this has had an impact on the way the Turkish political elite has been thinking about this problem since. And it was very clear that this will not be repeated in the context of 2020. This is a completely different Turkey. In 1994, the Americans were making sure that the Turkish army would not get embroiled in the Karabakh conflict, because this would have led to a confrontation with Russia, which was just emerging from the Soviet period, and the relationship, the military and political relationship, was still very strong. That a Turkish involvement would have been unthinkable, and so there was a lot of pressure on the Turkish political leadership in the 1990s not to get involved with the Karabakh issue. The situation is completely different now. And Turkish involvement also was predictable. And I think from going forward, everybody needs to factor in this involvement going forward, because it's not going to go away. Now, how and to what extent is another issue. I think there's been a lot of vocal support. And there has also been, I think, some military support. But within some limits. and it's very important that we keep this situation within some limits, and also, as much as possible, try to reduce external involvement, whether it's Turkey or anybody else. The region has enough problems. It doesn't need to import the problems from other places. So I think this is a situation that has aggravated the situation. It is not something that is, I repeat, I don't think this problem, if you want to call it a problem, is going to go away very soon. And it has to be managed in the same way that other factors have to be managed. I want to add a word on the OSCE Minsk group, because this was in the previous question and also it came somehow in the present question. Look, we should not shoot the messengers. The Minsk group have been, the three co-chair countries, the diplomats that are running this process have been doing their utmost for many years. Different people replaced different people. Some came with their own different styles and personalities to the process. But I think the wish to push towards a negotiated solution has been there. This has been, it's cited as an exemplary process involving Russia, the United States, and France, but it has not worked. And we also need to accept that despite all the goodwill of the Minsk process and of the co-chair countries, this has not worked. And it has not worked, I think, for two reasons. One is that the sides themselves were short of the point where they could engage in a way that would lead to a breakthrough in the negotiations. We never had a breakthrough. We had some positive moments, but never really a breakthrough to say, well, we now have a plan and everybody has agreed on this plan and we're moving forward on it. So after 26 years or more, this plan has not existed. And we're not beyond the point where everybody has agreed already on what the next steps are and is moving forward on them. And the second thing is that despite the fact that the three co-chair countries appear working very harmoniously together, the geopolitical situation is complicated, and it's much more complicated now than it has ever been in the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And this has created stresses on the Minsk process. And it puts the question mark whether at this point it's really these co-chair countries who should be taking the peace process forward, or whether they should be in the background waiting to endorse and support when there is a breakthrough, and that there's a need for something else in between what we have now and what we hope to have once an agreement is somehow identified. So on the one hand, don't blame the Minsk process, don't shoot the messengers, because their messages were the right messages, and it was not their fault that this process was not taken forward. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that this is the perfect mechanism for today. It may have been in 1992 or in 1994 or even in 2004, but we're now in a very complicated international and geopolitical context, and maybe an assessment of the new reality has also to be made.
I would suggest to look to the situation from a bit different angle, although I mostly agree with what was said by Lawrence and Dennis, and try to understand why the engagement of Turkey in this war is so consistent. Turkey is probably the only player, including not only Armenia, Artsakh, and Azerbaijan, but also Russia and the international community in general, is the only player that is losing nothing in this war. It is mostly Azerbaijani money that is spent for the war. These are mostly Azerbaijani soldiers and population that are suffering, and probably some mercenaries. I think that it is much probable that anyway, in a certain extent, terrorist mercenaries are engaged here. So Turkey itself is losing nothing. And that is why the longer the war goes, the better for Turkey in that sense, because every day of the war makes the hopes of Turkey to play a stronger role in the region become more probable. And certain success in this war will, of course, increase the influence of Turkey in the region, not only in Azerbaijan, but also in Georgia, which is quite important country for Turkey now. And of course, having more positive for Turkey format of relations with Russia will be another game. And I would also challenge somehow this formula, one nation, two states. It exists, of course. It is close to reality, but in the same time, we cannot say that the interests of Turkish leadership is fully harmonized with the interests of different elites in Azerbaijan and different layers of Azerbaijani society. I am sure, for instance, that Azerbaijani current leadership, the Aliyev clan, was so stable because it was managing to keep balance between Russian and Turkish influences, and this allowed them to be more independent from any external influences. If Turkey will strengthen its positions in Azerbaijan, this will create certain risks for the current Azerbaijani elites to keep the power as they want it. And there will be also risks for some parts of Azerbaijani society, because I'm fully confident that if Turkey increases its influence in Azerbaijan, we will see maybe thousands of arrests of people who would be linked to Fethullah Gülen in Azerbaijan. If before Azerbaijan was managing to have, let's say, more or less independent stance towards quite many people in this country that were directly or indirectly connected with the main enemy of Erdogan. But if Turkey will have more opportunities to dictate to Azerbaijani government what to do with those people, I guess they will have to retreat and allow many people to be persecuted. I think this is also quite important for Erdogan in terms of strengthening his position inside the country, facing certain external political challenges that are in Turkey, because we understand the economic situation and many other factors are not strengthening the position of Erdogan, taking into account that there will be elections quite soon. And one more thing that I wanted to say is that even if Turkey does not succeed in this, it will easily to improve, let's say, its reputation before many international players, including NATO, including EU, including US, which are maybe not so happy with the Erdogan's policy. If Turkey is looking anywhere, it will easily go back to the relations with its Western partners, and it will be gladly welcome if it makes such step. So Turkey, any moment, can return to the situation, let's say, of 2010, and will get a lot of economic support, a lot of other privileges from the West, which will, as I said, welcome its return to the previous status quo. And that is why I repeat what I said in the very beginning. Turkey is the only player here that is losing nothing in any situation. And that is why it can sacrifice lives, it can sacrifice resources of others, because it is not sacrificing anything itself.
Շնորհակալություն։ Թեև հրադադարի թեմային ձեր խոսքում բոլորդ անդրադարձակ, այդուհանդերձ ԵԱՀԿ խմբի անդամ երկրների ղեկավարները հրադադարի կոչերով են հանդես գալիս երկու անգամ հոկտեմբերի 10-ին, ապա 18-ին հրադադարի համաձայնությունը փաստացի չաշխատեց եւ մեջբերեմ Հայաստանի Հանրապետության վարչապետ Նիկոլ Փաշինյանի խոսքը, եթե սա լիներ զուտ Ղարաբաղի հարց, բանակցությունները արդեն սկսված կլինեին ԵԱՀԿ խմբի համանախագահ երկրների կամ նրանցից մեկի միջնորդությամբ։ Ինչու չեն սկսում, որովհետև Թուրքիան տարածաշրջանը վերաձևելու եւ տարածաշրջանում իր ազդեցությունը հաստատելու խնդիր է լուծում։ Ձեր կարծիքով հրադադարի ռեժիմ հաստատելու որևէ տարբերակ կա, պարոն Բրոերս։
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we've discussed the factors that are working against a ceasefire, and I fully agree with my colleague Dennis's comments that there are very serious new issues confronting the facts on the ground that a new ceasefire would have to address. I would frame this, building on that, I would frame this in terms of a kind of a paradox that the OSCE Minsk Group mediation process now faces. This paradox has been with us for a long time. It was very evident in the press releases of the OSCE Minsk Group in May 2016. And this is the paradox and kind of a chicken and egg situation between a new security context and a political process that has momentum and meaning, which is normally discussed in terms of substantive talks. So the problem, as I see it, is that we have a paradox where without a new security architecture, the parties cannot commit to a new political process. But without a commitment from the parties to a political process, there won't be international buy-in or contributions to a new security architecture on the ground. And so I think this is the dilemma that all of us are facing. And I think here it's worth mentioning, what would be the basis for a return to negotiations that would follow on from a ceasefire? Because as Dennis highlighted, a ceasefire in this context is first of all going to be very difficult to stabilize. And without some political movement, there is a very strong possibility that violence would resume in the spring if winter does indeed interrupt now. So the basic principles have been the core proposal on the table for a long time, but they evoke certain realities and have been designed to address realities that no longer exist meaningfully on the ground. So the question is, what is left out of the basic principles that could form a basis with sufficient incentives for the parties to re-engage? And that's very challenging to see right now. There was an assumption, as Boris mentioned, of a 5+2 formula with regards to the restoration of Azerbaijani jurisdiction over the surrounding territories. Azerbaijan now reportedly has restored control over 3 of these, and there are hostilities ongoing in others. President Ilham Aliyev has said that there can be no referendum in Nagorno-Karabakh. And the element of peacekeeping, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, is very complex. So the security offer to the Karabakh Armenian population and Azerbaijani returnees isn't at all clear. So in that sense, I think, this is the dual problem that we face, and it's very difficult to see a way through it. But I would fully back up what's been said, that we should not be shooting the messenger. The Minsk group, I think, is unjustly blamed for this situation, that it ignores the agency of actors on the ground and outside of the context who brought us to where we are today.
Շնորհակալություն, հարցս այսպես ձևակերպեմ, թերևս պարոն Սամոտ, քաղաքական վճիռ հետո հրադադար թե հրադադարն էլ քաղաքական որոշումներ։
I'm a big believer that the fighting has to stop. I think this has gone on for already too long. It's very easy for us to be talking here in these on geopolitical considerations. I know that every Armenian family, and possibly even every Azerbaijani family these days, has some son or some father or some cousin or some uncle out in the war, and they don't have any news of them. And this is a distressing moment for the societies in the two countries. We need to stop this fight. We need to stop this as soon as possible, even though we know that the political solution is not going to come easily. But I think there must be at this point already a commitment for the political solution. I think what worries me is that in the past, the political solution was considered to be some kind of a luxury, that maybe we'll have a political solution, but in the meantime, we'll go on with this a little bit of fighting and a little bit of peace and then a little bit of fighting again. Well, we're not there now. We're in a fully fledged war being fought with terrible weapons. This is not the war of 1992-94. I think all the people who went out to fight, let's say on the Armenian side, have realized that who have been veterans of the war in the 1990s, that this is something else. It's a completely different war. So let's not romanticize war. The title of this meeting talks about a good war. There is no good war, never a good war, because a war will always have huge suffering, and the consequences will be long-lasting, and you think you won something, but actually you lost a lot more. And so my point is that we, and when I say we, I mean the international community, I mean the peace-building community, I mean the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan, should really at this moment be focusing on stopping the fighting. But we know that this can happen only if also there is some vision of what will happen next. I'm not enthusiastic about a ceasefire that is just simply giving the sides time to rearm again, spend a lot of more money again on military equipment, so that in 3 or 4 months' time we'll have another round of this. This must stop. We have to really be thinking beyond this paradigm. And I think this is the challenge that we all have now. And when I say we, I mean, I repeat, it's the international community, it's the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's the governments of the countries involved, it's the political elites that have influenced this process so much, because they are part of it and it's part of them. So there's a lot of work to be done. But first priority, immediately, we have to make sure that this fighting stops as soon as possible. And as I want to repeat what I said a moment ago, it's never going to be a perfect process because the situation on the ground is extremely complicated. So it will never be a perfect process, but it can be, to a large extent, the fighting would have been stopped. There will be a lull, and I hope the weather will help us, and that will give some time, once the dust settles down, to start really reflecting on what has happened.
I fully support the idea that OSCE Minsk group co-chair should not be blamed. They did their best during the recent years because their mission was quite limited. It was about listening the sides and offering a model that is the closest for the positions of the sides. And I think the mediators managed to do that yet 15 years ago, latest, when they found a model that could work and or is at least closest to the possible one without a war. However, to implement this model, some additional factors needed to be in place. And first of all, this should be sufficient resources for the international community to guarantee implementation of the model. And the second, certain level of trust between the sides. I think after these 15 years, neither the resources for guarantees are the same as they were before, nor the trust between sides. And I think that this war is different to the previous escalation periods that even, let's say, the threat to diplomacy is not working. If we would remember early 90s war, then at least on the issues of, let's say, war prisoners or hostages, or information exchange between Azerbaijan and Armenian media was in place. Now we don't have. We have hatred of all types of societies in Azerbaijan and Armenia without even thinking about compromises. So I think we are in much worse situation that we had before. And that is why I think the sequence of steps that could be workable in the current situation, they are changing. And that is why at least Armenian side is raising so frequently the issue or the principle of remedial secession, which was never on the table. It was always discussed as possibility, but it was never on the table. But currently we see that in all official statements from Yerevan, this remedial secession principle is very much emphasized, because this is kind of the only possibility, according to my compatriots, to protect Armenians in Artsakh from being displaced or killed. But anyway, irrespective of what kind of model we are considering and what we want to achieve and what are the steps to achieve it, of course, the first two steps are obvious, for me at least. One step is to limit as much as possible the engagement of Turkey, because Turkey, as I explained in my previous intervention, is the main factor that is no way interested in stopping the war. And the second, stop the war or achieve certain level of ceasefire, starting from humanitarian, and maybe in the next stage after humanitarian ceasefire is ceasefire for the formulation of the agenda for the negotiations. Because I think without agreeing on agenda of negotiations, it would be senseless to speak about negotiations themselves, because I don't think that Baku and Yerevan have the same understanding about this agenda. But it has, with the help of international mediators, agreed, and then we can move forward. But again, stop the war is the first step that needs to be done.
Շնորհակալություն, պարոն Ամսարդյանն արդեն խոսեց Ղարաբաղի հնարավոր կարգավիճակի մասին։ Այդուհանդերձ, ինչպես վարչապետ Նիկոլ Փաշինյանը հայտարարեց, Ղարաբաղի հարցը ունի մեկ լուծում, անջատում հանուն փրկության։ Վերջին տասնամյակներում նման նախադեպեր աշխարհում եղել են Կոսովո, Արևելյան Թիմորի դեպքում լիովին է անկախացել, Կոսովոն մասամբ է անկախացել, հակամարտության կարգավորման այս սկզբունքը որքանով կաշխատի Արցախի դեպքում ըստ ձեզ, պարոն Բրոյեր, համեցեք։
Well, the recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh would mean the end of the Minsk process as we know it. It would preempt the definition of Nagorno-Karabakh status, which is the core issue for all parties. And so in that sense, I think there would be a huge political cost associated with that. And one has to ask, so what would be achieved by doing that for Armenia? Recognizing the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic would add a kind of a layer of, Armenia could be more open in terms of the support that it is extending to Nagorno-Karabakh, but that support is happening anyway. So there, it's not certain what the key benefit would be. And in the event of recognition, it would be crucial that other states would follow suit, and that isn't clear. So the risk is that Armenia could end up in the situation that Turkey's in with Northern Cyprus, with just one single unilateral recognition. And we have the examples also of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which have only been recognized by a handful of states. So in that sense, it is also a risk. It would also be a risk in the sense that if recognition was enacted in order to quickly achieve a unification, the modalities of that would obviously be extremely complex in current conditions. But that could be narrated as a policy of annexation, and once again evoke very serious political costs for Armenia in doing so. So I think there are lots of problems associated with the idea of remedial secession in this particular case. Armenia has declared its support and continued support for the Minsk process, and so it really would be a kind of a volte-face, a démarche from that policy if it were to recognize Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yes, if I can add to that. I also think that this question of calling for the recognition of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic in the present context, well, it may be a good political slogan, but diplomatically and realistically, first of all, I don't see it happening in the wider international community. And secondly, if countries are pushing for a solution of this problem politically and diplomatically, the last thing they will want to do is to do that, because it's very clear that once you do that, you've upped the stakes. So you're throwing oil on the fire, and I don't think anybody wants to throw oil on the fire at the moment. Now, this is regardless of what will happen in the future, within the framework of discussions on the political context and the political status. That is something that obviously has been at the heart, at the root of this whole conflict. But I think to be talking on issues of international recognition at this point is not really very realistic, and it would be much better to focus on some immediate objectives and immediate things that can be realized quite quickly. You mentioned also some examples, and it gets very confusing when you start doing that. East Timor is not Nagorno-Karabakh. East Timor was a colonial problem inherited from the Portuguese end of the Portuguese Empire. the situation was always extremely different from what it is with Nagorno-Karabakh. Even with Kosovo, there are some similarities, but then there are also some additional complications in the Karabakh situation that did not exist in the Kosovo situation. Kosovo is Kosovo, not Kosovo plus 20% of Serbia. So I think one of the things that has been a negative factor in this process in the last years has been a certain blurring of Nagorno-Karabakh as it was in the Soviet times and territories around it that have been depicted officially or semi-officially. I'm seeing maps all the time of Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, including not only the core of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also all the territories. And this blurs the situation and makes it even more difficult to unpack. So we need to be careful about the language used in these processes. This is a complete minefield, by the way, of its own, political minefield, because whatever you say, you always get somebody upset. But I think this is a time also for some plain speaking. I really don't want to open the whole issue of what has happened and what is happening. I think once the ceasefire is in place, the international community needs to make an independent evaluation and assessment of what has been happening. If war crimes have been committed, we need to be open about it. We need to expose them, whether they happened by whoever side that happened. I think these are things to be discussed further up the line. But at the moment, there are other priorities. Stop the fighting, and let's get the relevant people around the table to start discussing where to go next.
I think that the issue of recognition of the right for self-determination of Artsakh, and I would formulate it that way, not the recognition of the republic, but recognition of the right for self-determination. These are a bit different things, and it is important to differentiate those. But this issue is anyway contra-proportional to the situation in the front line. If there would be chances for ceasefire, I think that, of course, raising the issue in official level about recognition would be rather counterproductive. However, if the war continues and there will be no clear prospects about possibility to stop it, of course, this issue will become more and more discussed in Armenia and in some, let's say, communities abroad. So if we do not want to go deep in this, if we don't want this factor to influence possibility of ceasefire, then more efforts from the international community needs to be contributed to stop this fighting.
Շնորհակալություն, Արցախի խնդիրը ըստ էության կոնտեքստից կտրված չի, հայերս դիտարկում են որպես գոյաբանական խնդիր։ Հիշենք ցեղասպանությունը, Բաքվի Սումգայիթի ջարդերը, որքանով է այս գործոն անցալելի խնդիրը քննարկելու առումով, պարոն Բրոերս, համեցեք։
I think there is a broad awareness that this conflict is understood and perceived as an existential one for many people in Armenia, and particularly in Nagorno-Karabakh itself. You mentioned massacres and pogroms from the earlier period, from the late 1980s and early 1990s. I mean, I think that does raise the issue of legacies, unresolved legacies of massive human rights violations in the past. And it underlines the need, as my colleague Dennis said, for an independent international investigation of everything that has happened during these 3 weeks, so that serious violations of human rights and war crimes, if proved, are foregrounded as the legitimate subject of investigation, and not only by human rights organizations. So these issues need to be, really foregrounded and put into center stage in the post-war discussion of what's happened. So yes, I think the existential nature of this conflict, the reading of it as such, is perceived by the international community, and that I think bolsters the logic and calls for a ceasefire. I absolutely second what's been said about the terrible modern nature of this war. If President Putin's estimate of the number of people killed is accurate at 5,000, that's roughly 20% of the number of people that were killed over 6 years of conflict between 1988 and 1994, just within 3 weeks. So that shows the scale of the killing and of the destructiveness of this conflict, which is just underlines once again the urgent need to stop the fighting.
I think what the world absolutely does not want to see is Nagorno-Karabakh cleansed of its Armenian population. I think Nagorno-Karabakh has experienced a kind of ethnic cleansing already once, and it certainly must not experience it twice. How to protect the civilian population in this complex situation is a challenge, and it needs to be put on the agenda, definitely, as the situation evolves. If the objective of Azerbaijan is to occupy Stepanakert and other places in Nagorno-Karabakh, that immediately is going to raise a number of questions that will take this conversation to a different level. And at the core, not as a side story, but at the core of that conversation has to be the protection of the civilian population in any situation. And you're right to raise this point, and it's important that this is discussed, and is discussed now. We, maybe if I can be optimistic and say we're not there yet. I don't know exactly what has been happening on the ground because I'm not there. We hear a lot of stories. There is a basis of truth in some of these stories, but we also know that in the war, truth is the first victim. So, as I said, I am supporting an international assessment of the war, but then, whatever happens, the protection of the civilian population in Nagorno-Karabakh, because that is where the fighting is now seems to be approaching, then this needs to be an issue that needs to be discussed now by the international community, and I would support a focus on that. I want to repeat that I don't think that any one side in this conflict has the moral high ground. We have seen bad things from many sides, both before, and even there is even some basis to say in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So everybody needs to keep in mind that there are international legal obligations under international law which protects civilians wherever they are. And this message needs to be hammered in. It cannot be secondary. And the issue of protecting civilian populations, I think, needs to be really front and center of the discussion going forward.
I think to address this issue, existential threat to Armenians, it is very important that the international community recognizes that certain changes took place in the world since the 1990s. I perfectly remember, probably Lawrence and Dennis too, that when even in late 90s, somebody would say that Turkey is a threat to Armenia, most of the experts would take it as a joke, because they say it is not possible. Turkey is a member of NATO. Turkey has certain obligations before its partners in NATO, and it will never allow itself any offensive towards Armenia. Another important statement that I want to remember is the statement of our first president, Ter-Petrosian, who is from time to time saying that since establishment of United Nations organization, no state disappeared from the map. Only new states were appearing as members of the international community. However, if we assess the realities that we have now and assess, let's say, the resource of security policy of the international community, we have to recognize that it is very much possible that some states could disappear under the current circumstances from the map. And that we cannot exclude offensive of Turkey against Armenia. And this changes everything. And from that point of view, I think when we are formulating the tasks, when we are formulating agendas, when we are formulating models of reconciliation, we have to exclude from any discussions possibility of apparent lie. While we still are listening such lies, at least from Azerbaijani side, and it is still perceived by, let's say, the international community as something that has certain ground. However, I think it has to be very clearly, there has to be very clear reaction on any statements from Baku and from Ilham Aliyev, for instance, that there is Armenian community in Azerbaijan, which counts to 30,000 people, which is, I think, apparent lie for everyone. If even there are some people who have Armenian roots and living in Azerbaijan, these are people who lost their identity and do not even want to remember their identity because it would threaten their lives. And that is why I think such kind of statements should be immediately reacted by everyone, so that they are not at all among the arguments that are discussed from every side. Or let's say statement like Armenians themselves bombed the cathedral in Shushi. I mean, when one of the sides of the negotiation process are allowing themselves such statements, we could never achieve any constructive solution. So I think more principled position against any manipulation should be as a principle controlled by the mediators in the process of any kind of dialogue, any kind of interaction, or any kind of negotiations. And yes, until this kind of lies will be still Some of it will be very difficult to find any solutions and to be sure that at least existential threats to Armenians are more or less excluded from this context.
Շնորհակալություն քննարկմանը մասնակցելու համար, կարծես թե բոլոր բանախոսների հիմնական ուղերձը ռեզումեն այն էր, որ այդուհանդերձ վատ խաղաղությունը, վատ հրադադարը անհամեմատ լավ է ցանկացած պատերազմից, հիշեցնեմ, որ մեդիակենտրոնի քննարկման թեման էր վատ խաղաղություն կամ լավ պատերազմ, որն է Արցախյան խնդրի լուծումը եւ մեր բանախոսներն են քաղաքագետ վերլուծաբան Լոնդոնյան հաշտեցման ռեսուրսներ խաղաղարար ընկերության Կովկասի ծրագրերի տնօրեն Լոուրենս Բրոերսը, Բորիս Նավասարդյանը Երևանի մամուլի ակումբի նախագահ Եվրամիության արևելյան գործընկերության քաղաքացիական հասարակության ազգային պլատֆորմի նախկին համակարգող եւ Դենիս Սամութը Լինքս ընկերության ղեկավար Հարավային Կովկասի քաղաքական հետազոտությունների հեղինակ փորձագետ մեզ սինխրոն թարգմանության առումով օգնեց Սամվել Ռուբինյանը, շնորհակալություն Սամվել, շնորհակալություն հարգելի բանախոսներ, հուսանք, որ բանականությունը կհաղթի խաղաղություն բոլորին։